The subject this week is called the Three Powers, and I sort of struggle for a name for this topic. When I was working in Arnriach Fain, or ADF, the phrase used there is the three kindred, which implies that the members of these three groups that I'm going to be talking about are somehow related, that they're sort of a tribe, or to use perhaps the Irish word for the more extended group, the Tua. And I'm not sure that that's an entirely sort of far-reaching enough description, kindred, for the kinds of beings that we're talking about here. In short, what I'm going to be discussing are the deities, the ancestors, and what I tend to call the allies of the middle world, or the beings of the middle world, or the spirits of the middle world, depending on exactly what I'm talking about. And I'll explain what I mean by middle world when we get to that part of the talk. But these three groups are, in essence, the targets of sacrificial offerings and worship and prayer in general. And so I'm going to discuss each in its turn, and I'm going to start with the gods and goddesses. I'm prone to using the word deity to describe any member of this group of beings, this first of what I'm calling the three mighty powers. So to look at the gods and goddesses first. As a general catch-all term, I tend to use as often as not the word deity or deities. It's a little clunky to say gods and goddesses, and some people feel it's a little male-specific to say gods and not also say goddesses. And deity seems to me to be a nice, understandable catch-all word. But what does that word mean? It literally implies shining ones. And in essence, then, it's talking about what we could call, in general, celestial beings, heavenly beings, beings who dwell up where the bright shining lights are, the sources of energy. And in general, at least in many ancient cultures, there is often an identification between the planets, the sun, the moon, and gods and goddesses. Sometimes those heavenly bodies are seen as literally embodiments of one or more deities. We find that in ancient India and the Vedic culture. They had a group of gods they call collectively the Adityas, and those are the planetary objects, and I think also the sun and the moon. I think both of those objects are included in the category. These are sources of energy, though, in any event, whether they are literally embodiments of divine beings, or the sun is, say, a chariot for a god. There is often an identification between the source of light and heat, and indeed life, that the celestial bodies represent, and gods and goddesses. So this word that means shining ones seems to me to be a good word to apply to this category of beings to whom we offer respect and worship. But what are the gods and goddesses? It's not my purpose, let alone my place, to decide what they are, who they are, where they live. But I am going to offer some different approaches to understanding them. I'm not going to suggest that one is more valid than the other. In fact, I'm going to suggest the opposite. I'm going to suggest that an attitude of tolerance and an appreciation of diversity in understandings of the deities is a healthy attitude to take, and probably the only ultimately logical position to adopt. I'm going to look at these beings from three distinct perspectives, three pretty much distinct, separate, maybe even mutually exclusive ways of understanding them. First, we can look at them as being entities who once had a human existence. This, you perhaps could say, is a historical approach to understanding the nature of the gods and goddesses. There is a word, euhemerization, which, if you don't know it, is euhemerization, which is the position that a god or a goddess was a legendary figure, once a human figure, perhaps a great king, who down through the generations has come to be regarded as a deity. We see something close to that, I would say, when you look at a figure like King Arthur. And in maybe even more of a gray area in terms of having lived or not lived, a figure like Merlin, who is such a powerful wizard that his energy and his influence seems to transcend, literal human death. These figures are straddling a gray area between the realm of the gods and goddesses and the realm of history, and particularly in the case of Arthur, to whom there is historical reference, although we don't know for sure that such a person by such a name actually lived. He's absolutely a legendary figure, and much of what is said about him can't be accounted for as historical fact. He's somewhere in that misty borderland between ancient history and mythology. So there is an attitude that, say, a god like Odin of the Norse, or his German counterpart Wotan, was once a great tribal leader in the misty reaches of prehistory, and that over the centuries, such a figure comes to be regarded as a god. So that's one perspective. Maybe that's what the gods and goddesses are. Great figures from the deep reaches of the past. A different way to look at the gods and goddesses is to adopt an attitude that has become highly fashionable in the last 100 years or so, which is to see them as psychological in origin. Now, an extreme point of view in this line of thinking is to say that man created God, or the gods in this case, that there is no such thing really, that psychologically human beings have a need, sort of a lack, if you will, that has to be filled by a sort of creator entity, or perhaps multiple gods and goddesses. And so therefore, having a need to fill, human beings psychologically create gods and goddesses, or often just one god or goddess. The French existentialist Sartre argued for this sort of perspective. In fact, he actually talked about the concept of a lack, that human beings were prone to seeing that something was missing, that a piece was missing, that if you look at the crescent moon, for example, one could intuit that it could be a full disk, that human beings were capable of seeing what was missing, and that in regarding themselves, human beings could see themselves as imperfect, as flawed, as not complete, as not total. In short, as not perfect. And the only way to make that recognition is if one can suppose the possibility of a perfect being, by which human beings, when measured up, fall short. And so, therefore, following this sort of reasoning, human beings are prone to automatically supposing the existence, or at least the potential existence, of more perfected beings of one sort or another. That's an extreme perspective, though, and it is in a certain sense a rather atheistic one, and so kind of just outside the scope of the discussion here. But I throw it out there just for perspective. To pull a little bit more back into the realm of a theistic or polytheistic perspective, there is the notion that gods and goddesses are images generated, they're entities generated by so-called archetypes within the collective unconscious of human beings. This is a perspective that's mostly attributed to C.G. Jung, the Swiss psychologist. And the collective unconscious is, much misunderstood in the most literal sense, the sense that Jung initially proposed, The collective unconscious is essentially the instinctual part of the unconscious. The unconscious being that part of the mind that the human being has no direct access to, but that we experience in dreams and other forms of vision, or during moments of creativity where we're thinking and acting symbolically. That we have both a personal unconscious, but even deeper than that, all of us as human beings have a sort of an instinctual component to our unconscious that makes us human, that leads us to act in ways that are characteristically human, that we're, if you will, wired in certain ways in a deep unconscious level. And that the way that we're wired down there takes the form of sort of patterns, unrealized patterns within the psyche. And that as those patterns in the unconscious, in the deepest, most collective part of the unconscious, interact with the material that comes into consciousness, that comes in through the senses, and that's thought about in the conscious mind. As this dynamic interplay happens between the conscious mind and the deepest collective unconscious, images come up in dreams, in reverie, in works of art, and ultimately Jung and others would argue in myth, that gives form, that gives shape to these deep patterns of the unconscious. A very obvious archetype would be the mother archetype. And so one can argue that perhaps images of a great goddess are manifestations, either for any one individual or for social collectives, societies, cultures as a whole, of the mother archetype. That a great goddess figure is, in some sense, a manifestation, either in individual dreams or in cultural myths, of the mother archetype. Now, there's often a confusion in the use of that term archetype, and partly it's because other psychologists following in Jung's tradition have used the word in different ways, creating some confusion. But what Jung intended, and that I think is a very interesting concept, is that archetype just referred to an unrealized potential in the collective unconscious, in the non-personal, instinctual part of the deepest depths of one's psyche. And that generated from that, in a very personal and particular way, various images of entities arise that have their own independent personality that can manifest, in the worst case psychologically, as what Jung would call complex, where these personalities generated by the unconscious start to take control of us. They operate independently. We find ourselves acting perversely against our own interests sometimes, neurotically, if you were to use Freud's earlier terms. We are, as Jung sometimes put it, in that case, possessed by an archetype. That deep unconscious pattern has manifested itself as its own autonomous identity, and it has taken control of us. And that, seems to me, is not too terribly different from what gods and goddesses in various different cultural contexts are seen to do, to take possession of human beings. So this is, again, a very psychological approach to understanding what a deity might be, but it does move us right into the realm in which we most often encounter deities, which is in mythological narrative. Thinkers like Jung have argued that myths are, in a sense, the records of the dreams of the collective, of the culture as a whole. And so the images of gods and goddesses that emerge out of the shared experiences and the shared tale-tellings of individual cultures are, in a certain sense, the images arising from the deepest archetypes shared by the members of those individual cultures. So just to move on to the third of these three approaches to thinking about the nature of the gods and goddesses, there's, of course, the most literal interpretation, and that is the supernatural one, which is to say, following Shakespeare, that there are far more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. That there are things that are not knowable by human consciousness, that are not quantifiable by the scientific method, that lie outside of the realm of the natural, hence supernatural. On this mode of thinking, by this mode of thinking, to taken to an extreme, we get sort of the Christian approach to deity, which is to say there is a transcendent being, ultimately unknowable to us, although capable of being experienced by us, who is transcendent, which is to say is outside of our experience, is not part of our natural environment, of the natural universe that surrounds us. That in fact, this being, to focus for a second on the Christian God, sits outside of our universe in a sense, or at least of the universe that we're capable of experiencing directly, and manipulates it, is the ultimate prime mover for it, created the universe in the beginning. That this God is separate, is transcendent, is outside of our existence, but yet interacts with it. This is probably the most commonplace, not just the most literal interpretation of what the gods and goddesses are, that they are beings who dwell elsewhere. And different people take different approaches to understanding what that word elsewhere might imply. In the Celtic frame of reference, we would think of a couple of possible interpretations of where elsewhere is. One would be in the she-mounds, in the underworld, if you will, beneath fairy mounds. More generally, more loosely, one could say that these beings dwell in the other worlds. Having once been in the physical environment of our world, for whatever reason, perhaps because they were expelled by the coming of men, they moved on into a different place, perhaps on the other side of a veil of fog or mist, or perhaps beyond the ninth wave of the sea. Wherever that really is, now the gods and goddesses on this view dwell elsewhere. And when you look at some of the narratives from Irish literature, you find the ability of human beings to physically travel to these other worlds, whether by ship or by passing through a fog, or sometimes just literally being transported. It's interesting to see how human beings are capable of moving from their world along a sort of seemingly normal journey, as I say, by, say, a boat trip or across a misty plain, and find themselves having moved seamlessly into a realm occupied by powerful otherworldly beings, which implies that that's perhaps the same sort of journey that those beings undertook themselves when they left the physical world that's now inhabited by men. So those are three very, very different, perhaps mutually incompatible ways of looking at deities. That they are residual legends, sort of para-history, if you will, of tales of ancient great human beings that are now have lost their human standing and are come to be regarded as something more immortal. That the gods and goddesses are images, autonomous personalities that we experience that are generated by both our individual unconscious and by the groups, the culture's unconscious, or that gods and goddesses are simply beings that dwell somewhere else that occasionally either interact with our world or come into our world by various means, and that we are not capable as human beings of understanding what their nature and location really is. Now, I would argue that it's pretty much impossible to distinguish between an apparition that has come to you from somewhere else, from some other plane, and a powerful psychological image generated from the most profound depths of the unconscious. The unconscious being a pretty vast place. We're prone sometimes as Westerners to undervalue just how vast a place the unconscious mind can be, or to overestimate how capable we are of understanding. And so my tendency is to think that when presented with a powerful image, powerful visionary image, I'm not capable of distinguishing necessarily whether it's psychologically generated, which is to say generated by the vast universe inside me, the vast unknowable universe inside me, or generated by the vast unknowable universe outside. At a certain point, the sort of infinite interior universe and the infinite exterior universe amount to the same thing. And hence my sort of original statement that not being hung up on deciding that one or more of these approaches to understanding deity is better than another, is more accurate than another, is probably the only logical place to go. Certainly, adopting that attitude leads to greater tolerance of diverse approaches, and I would argue, therefore, greater tolerance of one's fellow human beings. How do the gods and goddesses figure into the life cycle of the average polytheist, the average modern polytheist, druid, pagan? What I find more often than not as I meet modern polytheists is that they have special relationships with one or more of the gods and goddesses. Sometimes they're from multiple cultures. Often these days, maybe more these days than in years past, they're from a particular ethnic culture, like, say, the Irish, or more generally the Celtic. But that usually one or two, sometimes three or four gods and goddesses seem to be of particular importance to modern pagans. Often they're referred to as a patron or matron, or patrons and matrons, if there's more than two of them. This is somewhat controversial. There are those who would argue that that wasn't really an attitude taken in antiquity. But we do know that, for example, in Roman culture, the pagan practices of the ancient Romans, that it was understood that every human being had one sort of divine spirit that was matched up with them, that could look out for them, and to whom it was important to make offerings. This is akin to the sort of Christian and New Age notion of a guardian angel, or what writers like the contemporary psychologist Jim Hillman talk about as being your daimon or daemon, a personal spirit that embodies your life or your life path or your identity as an individual human being, and that it is to this being, this god or goddess, that one needs to be sure to make sustaining offerings, because this, above all others, is a supernatural entity that is going to help take care of you. People who had certain professions might have a particular patron of their profession to whom they might want to cultivate a beneficial relationship. A blacksmith, say, would look to the Irish god Gwyvnew, or to the Greek god Hephaestus, or any of a number of other smith gods. In dealing with, say, the dead, the passing of a loved one, and I'll come back to this actually in just a couple minutes, one would have to make entreaties to, and perhaps offerings to, some sort of a god or goddess who had the custody of the dead, or perhaps was a psychopomp figure who was responsible for the safe passage of the dead from the mortal plane into whatever otherworldly existence they were going to move. So different gods and goddesses take on different roles, and I think loosely, we could divide them into gods and goddesses who fill specific roles, and gods and goddesses who are near and dear to any individual pagan for reasons that may not be logical, that may simply be a calling, if you will, or a claiming. Oftentimes people will say that they've been claimed by a certain deity, and it can't necessarily explain how or why that happens. In addition to the gods that we have a certain kind of familiarity with as individuals or as groups, it was acknowledged among the ancients that often there were gods and goddesses, deities abroad in the land who were unknown to us. Homer has Odysseus, I believe, at one point in the Odyssey, making landfall in an unfamiliar place, making offering to the gods or goddesses unknown to him of that place. And this was apparently quite ordinary for the ancients. In coming into a new place, one did not want to offend whatever powerful spirits, whatever powerful beings might be brought into place. One wanted to tread carefully and be a good guest in someone else's home, if you will. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of who the gods might be is a bit more Celtic specific. And that is to try to just glance at the evolution of the Irish pantheon, if you will, referred to as the Tuatha Dé Danann, a phrase which is most often translated as the people of the goddess Danu or Dana. That's not necessarily a perfect translation, frankly, but that's the most common one that you'll encounter. But they were, for all intents and purposes, the gods and goddesses of the pagan Irish. They had their own society centered on Tara, Tara being also the seat of the High King of the human beings in Ireland. It was, it seems, in pre-human times when the gods walked abroad in Ireland, also the seat of the Irish gods. Well, Tuatha Dé Danann has become a phrase that refers to what we tend to loosely, glibly talk about as the fairies, or the fair folk. There is up until very recently, sort of a synonymous usage of the two terms. We can talk about the fair folk, the noble ones, fairies, and you could say Tuatha Dé Danann and essentially mean the same thing. They were the beings that dwell in the fairy mounds, the she mounds, the she folk, she being Sidhe, typically. The people under the mounds. Now that seems to argue for a post-Christian recasting of pagan mythology into non-religious folklore or superstition. And religions are prone to doing that. The Greeks bequeathed to us the distinction between religion and superstition, between religio and superstitio, where superstitio or superstition was essentially what other people believed. And so in Christian times, I think it's fair to argue that you can't really eradicate all these powerful tales of powerful beings that gripped the imagination of the culture for generations, but it is possible to recast them into a new light or into a different context. And so if the gods and goddesses of the pagan Irish couldn't be gods and goddesses anymore because Christianity, which had become the one true faith, argued that there could only be one true God, well, they had to become something else. And so they found themselves recast as spirits, elves, if you will, akin to other beings like the dryads and the naiads of the Greeks, and beings to whom I'm actually going to come back to and finish up talking about at the end of the talk. It's important to recognize that the relationship of ancient pagan humans to the gods and goddesses, the deities, was seen as one of reciprocity. It wasn't one of one-way adoration. It was understood that these beings were powerful and had immense influence in the cosmos as human beings experienced it and lived in it. But it was important to be in a beneficial relationship with them. And it was understood that the gods and goddesses responded to the extension of hospitality. That if you offered them gifts, if you kept them fed, if you showed them that you really did value them to the extent that you would extend yourself by the giving of items of worth or food that was valued in a certain way, that the gods and goddesses would recognize that generosity and that they would be bound by codes of mutual hospitality just as other human beings would. That if you offered your hearth to someone and the time came that you presented yourself at their door as their prospective guest, they would be honor bound to receive you. It was understood by the ancients that the gods and goddesses were bound by those same sorts of codes of mutual respect and mutual hospitality. And so one of the major driving engines of ancient Indo-European pagan religions, and one of those was ancient Druidism, was the sense of breaking bread with the deities, the so-called shared meal with the gods and goddesses, the offering of when animal sacrifice was practiced in ancient times, offering a choice portion of that which had been slaughtered and was being shared by the people with the gods and goddesses. So this is something I'll return to in other talks, but that idea of the gods and goddesses, the deities as receptive to hospitality, receptive to generosity, and then being capable of sharing with human beings in return, was probably the single most important bit of ideology in ancient paganism. Certainly would have been central to the ancient Druids. And it's central, I think, to most modern traditions that purport to, or at least aim to, embody the practices and the ideologies of the ancient pagans. I'm going to shift gears and talk for just a little bit about another common target of our veneration, and that is the ancestors. Now you'll hear the phrase ancestors of blood and spirit used a lot by Neo-Pagans, and I think it's a good one. It's kind of a slippery slope when you start to practice the veneration of the ancestors if you take that too literally, and especially if you start to do shared practices venerating the ancestors. If you're too literal about it, it starts to become exclusionary, and it can become, in its worst manifestations, outright racist. If one assumes that there has to be some sort of test of blood relationship to a given group of historic or prehistoric ancestors in order to participate in giving admiration, respect, and veneration to the ancestors, then you're being led down the primrose path towards what is ultimately a racist and exclusionary attitude. And most neo-pagans are rather opposed to that, and thankfully so. But we do know that the ancients venerated the ancestors. Certainly, as far as we can tell, all of the Indo-European cultures, including the Celts of the Druidic times, had some form or another of a cult of the dead. Various tomb configurations and cemetery arrangements allowed for various kinds of veneration of the dead. I've read of tombs in Greece, for example, that had tubes in their capstone through which beverage could be poured. I don't know if food could be put in, but you could pour a libation of wine literally down into the grave. So it was understood that one could help sustain the dead in their otherworldly existence one way or another. Certainly for the Celts, at least at various times and in various parts of the areas in Europe where we think Celtic languages were spoken, grave goods were interred with the departed, sometimes very expensive, elaborate grave goods, which one assumes were being interred so that the departed could use them in the other worlds, could carry on the same lifestyle in the other worlds that they had carried on in this one. And down into historic times, as folk practice, not so much religion, at times like Samhain, Celtic New Year, there are customs in various places of offering food and drink, leaving food and drink out for the dead. Just as there are in other situations, food and drink left for the fair folk. And we see various other kinds of manifestations of reverence or at least special regard for the dead. There are instances in the archaeological record of people having interred dead bodies in the foundations of structures. Niches are created in dwellings to receive the skulls of the dead. The Celts having had a particular interest, it seems, in the head as the center of identity. So perhaps in a certain sense, a place where the spirit of the departed would linger, or the identity of the departed would linger. So something worth having around. But what about us today? We don't keep skulls of our dead grandparents in our homes. I don't. And I'm not sure I know anybody who does. I don't think I do. So some people I know might surprise me. What are the dead to us? I mean, what are the ancestors? When we say ancestors of blood and spirit, what does that imply? I think the important thing, first of all, is that the ancestors, as much as the gods, whether we believe in their continued existence after death, literally or psychologically, to harken back to the distinctions I made with the deities a little while ago, one thing the ancestors absolutely are is the path down which our own narrow little personal history has trod to deposit us where we are. We are, I think, inescapably the sum total of all the actions, all the decisions made by everyone that we've ever been related to in the past. So those ancestors of blood, whether we believe that their personalities still exist after death and hover around us or stand watching us from the other worlds, whether we, as individuals, take that literal interpretation or not, we are still inescapably the sum total of all their actions. We carry them with us, and we embody them in all that they were, not just in our DNA, but in where we sit and what we do, where we're sitting. On the other side of that phrase, blood and spirit, though, we can look at the ancestors as role models, as that there are those who have gone before us, who we may not be descended from literally, genetically, but who provide powerful examples of proper behavior, of lives that we seek to emulate, that we're inspired by. And in the same way that one can be inspired by the exploits of a god or goddess as set down in the mythological narrative, so too we can be inspired by and wish to somehow repay across the boundaries of time, space, and life and death, these beings who've gone before us and literally blazed the trail for us, in whose footsteps we would yearn to be worthy to walk. And so it's worth our acknowledging, it's worth our taking the time out to make conscious for ourselves our debt, both to those literal ancestors who've left us where we stand now, and also those ancestors of spirit, those who are our role models that help to define where it is we wish to walk forward from here. Just a couple of other thoughts about those who've gone before. I mentioned grave goods being deposited that would sustain the dead in the other worlds. Well, where exactly are those other worlds? What are they like? Now, one can make all the same arguments about psychological versus supernatural nature to these otherworldly realms. I won't rehash that. Afterlife existences for Indo-European peoples seem to take a couple of basic different forms. We mostly see sort of what some writers call an Elysium, like the Elysian fields of the ancient Greeks, a happy otherworld, a place that one goes to that might have features very much like our own mortal world, might be in many respects a reflection of the existence that we're all familiar with as living human beings, but that may extend on indefinitely, or might have more heightened features or greater delights than the realm in which we live now. Those things that one aspires to or one most enjoys, or the things that most define a human being as successful and worthy of respect, those pursuits can be indulged in sort of ad infinitum in this Elysium that shows up in things like the Valhalla for the Norse, or Tir na Nog, the land of youth, i.e., eternal youth in the Irish myth. The Greeks, and perhaps other peoples as well, had more than one kind of other world, afterlife existence. They had another sort of place you could go that we could roughly call a limbo, sort of place for shades, for beings who have moved on but have not retained their individual personalities fully. We don't have real good evidence for that sort of afterlife, otherworld existence in other Indo-European cultures. There's no real good evidence for that among the Celts, particularly. But it's possible that people saw that as another alternative, sort of not necessarily purgatory, but just simply a place where the human psyche went, psyche in the sense of soul, went after human life for people who weren't heroic, who hadn't earned the delights of an Elysium. So that's one other possible alternative. There is a third scenario that finds itself particularly attached to ancient narratives about the Druids, ancient discussions of the Druids and their beliefs, and that is the notion of reincarnation. And this isn't just reincarnation in the sense of incarnating, that is, taking flesh in an afterlife existence, in another worldly existence, but coming back into the mortal realm, embodied as another human being. Perhaps more, to be more precise, we should say the transmigration of the soul, of the psyche, into a new existence, moving, migrating from one embodied existence into a new life, a new embodied life in this world. It was argued that the ancient Druids believed in that. Their beliefs were compared to Pythagoras, the Greek thinker, who apparently did believe in that concept and popularized it to some degree. But we don't really have any evidence beyond a couple of references that compared the Druid beliefs to Pythagoras' beliefs to suggest that the ancient Druids really believed in that. And in fact, as you look at the mythology, there's very, very little evidence that that belief was prevalent. There are a couple of references to this sort of thing happening in the Irish mythology. I think King Mangan was regarded as the second coming of the hero Finn McCool. So perhaps that belief was extant, but probably wasn't a major feature of Druidic thought. In reality, the body was reincarnated, but where it was reincarnated was in some other sort of Elysia existence. And I just wanted to touch for just a moment on who might be ruling over such a place. We find in the ancient Indo-European cultures very frequently a lord of the dead, somebody who sort of keeps watch over the dead, hosts their feast hall, that sort of thing, is responsible for their for watching over them, for their safe conduct into the other world, that sort of thing. And in more than one culture, including the Irish culture, that figure was originally immortal, and he's often seen as the first mortal to pass away in the land. For the ancient Indian peoples, the Vedic peoples of India, the Lord of the Dead was Yama, and he was exactly this kind of figure. He was formerly immortal and is now the person to whom offerings were made, the being to whom offerings were made for the protection of the newly departed. In Ireland, all the way at the other end physically of the Indo-European world, the figure of Donn, D-O-N-N, which literally implies a dark being, was seen as the Lord of the Dead, and he was the first mortal, so the tale goes, to perish in the land of Ireland. And so he then takes on the role of the keeper of the feast hall of the dead. And so it seems to me that it's worth getting that image in mind in working with the ancestors, that if one were to want to create for oneself a protocol for offering a meal, say, to the ancestors, that it's worth paying some respect to the ultimate giver of hospitality to the dead. If one envisions the dead as collectively abiding in a happy other world, or maybe not happy, but an engaging other world where all the pursuits that one would aspire to pursue in this life can be pursued. That the keeper of that world, in the sense of the host of that world, is this Lord of the dead, and perhaps before working with the ancestors or offering to or inviting the ancestors to participate, that first ancestor, the one who made the hall available for the dead to come and feast, should be acknowledged. In my own personal work, I deal primarily with the deities and with the ancestors. And only from time to time, as the occasion arises, do I really make reference to or make offering to or give substantial respect to what I would call the third of the three powers I'm discussing. Those being the spirits and other allies of the middle world. Now, I'm going to talk in a subsequent discussion about the three realms, about land, sea, and sky, an upper world, a lower world, and a middle world, in essence. But to make quick work of that, we dwell in the middle world, what is in Norse mythology Midgard, literally the middle realm. And so when I talk about the beings or the allies or the spirits of the middle world, we're talking about literally that. Whatever other entities dwell in the cosmos that we experience, the world as we experience it in our daily living existence. And tradition and individual experience presents us with several different categories of beings that fall into this third category of powerful beings that are worthy of respect, this third of the three powers collectively. The first I've already alluded to when I talked about the Tua Jedanan as having come to be regarded as spirits in the she mounds, in the mounds that were found in the landscape of Ireland and elsewhere, as being the fair folk, if you will. Well, these are the fairies. They're one of any number of categories of spirits, of non-human, non-corporeal, non-embodied spirits that human beings can see or otherwise sense abroad in the land. Sometimes our experience of them is of aspects of their being that appear to be bleeding over or leaking through, in a sense, from some other world separated by just a thin veil of some sort, as, for example, when the music of the fairies is heard. So we're experiencing them here in our waking life in some way, and we may or may not see them, but in some way we may sense their existence. And the folklore, including quite recent folklore, is full of people experiencing hearing music, otherworldly music, here in the middle world. There are many, many cultures around the world, not just Indo-European cultures, certainly not just Celtic cultures, that see the world as being home to a myriad of spirits. The animist religions of the world are center on that ideology, on the belief that individual trees, individual rocks even, may have their own indwelling spirits, their own potential to act powerfully for or against human interests, individual or collective, and that entreating in some way or another these spirits is how one goes through life in the most, I guess I should say, in the least obstructed manner. That one does not want to alienate or antagonize the spirits abroad in the land. That was pretty common belief for the ancient Indo-Europeans. The Norse, for example, the Scandinavians, left us tales of coming into places like parts of Iceland and making offerings to appease the land wights, the beings of the land, sort of elf-like beings that one would presume to be resident in any new landscape in which someone would come to settle. And we have at least sketchy records of the sorts of rituals that might be undertaken to make offering to such beings. The Greeks have a whole bestiary of woodland spirits and undersea spirits and spirits of the air and of the fire and so on. That the whole natural world is full of non-human entities. So spirits of the land are one category of our allies of the middle world. People who have done shamanic work frequently find animal allies. And in the same sense that, say, the fair folk might present themselves to us fully in this world or only simply present certain aspects or a sense of themselves in this world, same thing is true with animal allies or totem animals, if you will. And here we're in a sort of a gray area between spirit entities and literal allies of this world. We do work with animals on a daily basis, whether they're pets or more, in a more occult sense, a familiar, or even objects for augury. There are lots of traditions for divining the future from the flight of birds. So the literal animals that surround us in this world have a level of personality and also a spiritual or even supernatural, if you will, dimension to them that one can work with or at least acknowledge. And there's a continuum, I suppose, between the literal cat that sits next to you on the couch and cat more generally as totem animal, as a symbolic beast that sums up something about who you are and how you are in the universe or how you relate to the universe. And so these beings, too, fall into allies of the middle world. Sometimes I collectively refer to them as allies of fur, fin, and feather. And of course, it would be easy to forget about the most obvious ally of the middle world, which is our fellow human beings. We have more influence over this, our middle world, than any of the other beings, certainly at this point in the history of the planet. We could easily eradicate ourselves one way or another down the road, but for now we have a tremendous responsibility to the other beings of the middle world, because whether we have actually been gifted with stewardship of the middle world, as some religious traditions would have it, or whether we've assumed it by some sort of evolutionary coup d'etat, the fact remains that we can undertake good or poor stewardship. And it seems to me that along with being conscious of these other powers abroad in the land and outside the land, we have a responsibility to be conscious about and exercise good judgment in our own actions and in what we do in a religious setting communally. By what we do in that setting, we can help to influence that the conduct of that stewardship and the quality of that stewardship. And that is all I have to say about the three powers.